Hey everybody, it's Trina again from Life's a Blog. How was your week? Well, in southwestern Ontario, we're experiencing snowmageddon, and it hasn't been that delightful because it really brings the mental health down. I guess if you're a skier, it could be exhilarating, but as it is right now, I'm not feeling too positive about this weather continuously happening. But I'm making my way and I'm getting around, and I'm doing what I can to keep on keeping on, and that is the main thing, right? So, I did something this week, actually, probably lately, that kind of ticks me off a tad. And it's going to be the topic of our discussion today on the podcast, and that's one-sided relationships. So, I've come to see that I'm not very communicative, I think that's a word, to my friends. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I was always the one tagging them on Facebook or phoning them to see what they're up to, or just reaching out to see if they wanted to get together. And I just haven't been doing that anymore. Life has become really busy. I've had a little bout of depression and anxiety, but still no excuses. We got to keep forging ahead. My doctor and I talked about taking some sort of anxiety or depression pill, and I don't want that. I mean, I'm too strong for that, and I can keep forging ahead. Many can't, but we all know our bodies, and I'm doing quite well. I just recognize that I'm being that bad part of the one-sided relationship. And, just last weekend, my friend, her mother passed away, and 6 years ago, I would have been the first one there, and my Saturday got busy, and I just stopped in my tracks in the evening, and I thought, oh my God, I completely and utterly forgot. And I contacted her, and I apologized profusely and told her that wasn't being a very good friend. And it was actually an aha moment for me on how much I've been communicating with my friends and allowing them to contact me rather than me contacting them and keeping in touch. So I've made it a pact for 2026 to be more in touch with them as they are with me. And because, I know there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a one-sided relationship. I've been in many, and not the kind that comes from conflict, the kind that comes from carrying the weight of connection alone. And this episode isn't about blame, it's about clarity. Because at some point, effort stops feeling generous and starts feeling required. You are the one initiating the conversations, the one adjusting, the one explaining, the one holding space, and so slowly, without meaning to, you start shrinking your needs to keep the relationship intact. And in the self-help world, there's a lot of talk about communication and patience, but very little about honesty about what happens when the effort is not mutual. Today, we're going to talk about one-sided relationships, what they actually look like, why they drain you, and how to respond without abandoning yourself or trying to convince someone to meet you halfway. This is about recognizing when connection has turned into compensation and deciding what you are no longer willing to carry alone. I've spent enough time in one-sided relationships to recognize the pattern early now. Not just romantic ones, professional, friendships, even familiar dynamics where effort quietly became expected instead of mutual. And this episode, again, is not about calling anybody out. It's about calling something in. Awareness, boundaries, and self-respect. Because one-sided relationships rarely start that way. They evolve slowly. You step in to help. You make space. You lead with empathy. And over time, you become the person doing most of the emotional labor while telling yourself it is temporary until it's not. We scroll TikTok and Instagram, and there's a lot of encouragement to communicate better, to be more patient, to understand where the other person is coming from. And that advice has value, but it becomes harmful when it teaches you to override your own signals in the name of being easy to be with. And today we're talking about how to recognize when effort is no longer mutual, and how to stop overfunctioning without creating drama, and how to step back without self-abandonment. And this isn't about fixing someone else, it's about fixing the relationship you have with yourself. So just recently, I realized what I was feeling was not confusion. And there was resentment starting to form. And that matters because resentment does not show up randomly. It shows up when your boundaries are being crossed quietly over time. It's been a year, and initially I started with empathy, and then I moved on to goal setting. And each and every time the response was negative, the response was accusatory, the response had the silent treatment, until I went to my therapist one day and she asked me a pointed question. And that is finally when I took action and I started talking in a very legalese tone. It didn't work out so great for me because that person came back with 20,000 times more venom than what initially was happening. But I knew I had to stand my ground, and it was quiet from inside that I just knew that I had to stand my ground. And this is where the conversation about boundaries become essential. And it's not a punishment or it's not ultimatums, but it's self-preservation. And by explaining what you need out of that relationship isn't a fault of yours. It is a strength of yours, because we all deserve to be treated in a specific way. And if the other part of that relationship is not reciprocating and using your time, effort, honesty, love, then it really needs to be brought to surface. And Brene Brown talks about this in a way that reframed it for me. She says that boundaries are not about keeping people out. They are about protecting yourself from resentment. And once I heard that, I could no longer unsee it, because if resentment is building, it is not a sign you're asking for too much. It's actually a sign you've been giving too much for too long. And that is where this conversation really begins. You have to open up and speak up for yourself and say what you need, what your needs are as a human being on this planet. And sure, you may get a lot of hate. And believe me, from experience, I think I do get a lot of hate from specific people. But that's okay. Because when I look around me and the friends that I told you that I've been distancing myself from, they're the gold. They're the gold. Stop running towards the bronze when you've got the gold. And once you understand that resentment is a boundary issue, the next question becomes practical. What do you actually do with that information? Because awareness without action just turns into rumination. Boundaries help you name the problem. Behavior tells you whether it will change. And this is where I stopped listening to what people said they felt and started paying attention to what they were willing to do. Not once, not occasionally, consistently. Mel Robbins articulates this in the most direct way possible. When someone shows you how little effort they are willing to put in, believe them. That line cuts through the noise because it removes hope from the equation and replaces it with evidence. It asks you to stop negotiating with potential and start responding to reality. Boundaries show you where the line is. Behavior shows you whether someone intends to meet you there. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to keep explaining away what is not being offered. You know, way back, probably in the 90s, I had this most wonderful friend. And she was a part of my wedding. She was a part of my first child. And then she moved, and I felt like my whole life had been crushed because she moved. So we ended up moving too. And it was only then when I was busy with 2 toddlers and I was constantly packing them up and going and visiting that I realized that the relationship was absolutely one-sided. And I started drifting away and finding other friends that actually wanted to contribute, and their behavior showed me that they really wanted to be friends with me. And I hold no resentment against that person whatsoever, except for the fact, no, don't even get into that, but that was years later. But it was a friendship that was slowly phasing away. We moved to this unknown place. We both had different dreams as soon as we got here. I was busy with toddlers. I couldn't make time, make space without it being a huge effort. And the more I went over and realized it wasn't being reciprocated, I did feel resentment. But then I did start watching the behavior, and I made that decision to finally just kind of do my own thing. Now, 20 years later, we always see each other at funerals, and I'll always make it a point to show myself when she's in need. Absolutely. But that friendship can be looked at fondly from the past. But as it grew, it just no longer became the friendship that I needed anymore. And then once you start responding to behavior instead of potential, something else becomes clear. Effort is not just about showing up. It is about sharing the weight of the relationship. And that is where the idea of mutuality comes in. Not equally in every moment, not keeping score, but a shared sense of responsibility for connection. Esther Perel says that love is not self-sacrifice, it's mutuality. And that distinction really matters because self-sacrifice often looks like devotion on the surface, but underneath it usually is imbalance. In one-sided relationships, emotional labor becomes invisible. You are the one remembering, the one checking in, the one smoothing things over, the one anticipating moods and managing outcomes. Over time, that labor starts to feel less like care and more like a job you've never applied for. And this is where many people lose themselves quietly. They mistake carrying the relationship for being committed to it. You know, I had this friend where I saw them in a relationship, and I don't know, it was his 50th birthday, and he was sitting alone, and I said, no one came to be with you on this birthday, this monumental birthday. Said, no, it's okay. So I got some cupcakes and brought them over to him and said, you can't be alone on your birthday. That's just not cool, especially if you're in a relationship. And I think that was my moment where I looked at loving relationships and thought to myself, like, I would never want that in a million years. I would never want that relationship that there's no drop-ins, no surprises, no joy of life. There's something always really cool about being there for someone, even in the most unexpected moments. Like, I was dating this guy, and I drove in a blinding snowstorm to go and see him one evening, and I just thought that was kind of cool. And there's been different times once when I dated that guy where it's like, hey, what you doing for dinner? Nothing. Okay, let's just do this then. That spontaneity, the mutuality, that's exactly what it was. It was the mutuality. It's not one-sided. Even with friendships, it's not supposed to be one-sided. And, especially in love relationships, I feel really sad when I see relationships like that. There should be no problem that if, one person's street is on a winter storm alert and someone else has plenty of parking, that you can make your way back to one another very easily if there's mutuality. And Nendra Glover Tawwab names this clearly. Overextending yourself does not make you kind. It makes you depleted. And depletion is not neutral. It changes how you show up. You become tired. You become less expressive. You stop asking for what you need because it feels safer to manage disappointment than to name it. And that is how emotional labor turns into emotional erosion. Mutuality is not about grand gestures. It's about reciprocity in the small things. Who reaches out? Who repairs? Who notices? Who adjusts? If you are doing most of the work, the relationship is not failing. It's revealing its limits. And I've come to realize that by doing the research on one-sided relationships, because I so terribly failed a few of my very close friends in the last 2 months that it all kind of intertwines, whether it be a romantic relationship, a friendship, even a business relationship. It's all going to intertwine. It's all going to end up with mutuality and consistency and just those moments of surprise and undying love and respect for that other person. Because that's really what we all want. So when emotional labor goes unshared for a long time, it does not just exhaust you, it actually traps you. Because the moment you consider doing less, guilt shows up. And the moment you keep doing more, resentment follows. That push and pull is not accidental, it's the emotional cost of imbalance. Harriet Lerner explains it this way. When we do more than our share, we feel taken for granted. When we do less, we feel guilty. Neither is sustainable. That is the internal conflict most people live in for far too long. You are either overfunctioning and resentful, or you're pulling back and questioning yourself. There's no peace in either position. And I can tell you, I've felt very guilty not reaching out to my friends. But the aha moment has driven me to even try harder now in keeping that friendship at an equal balance, because they've really tried hard with me and they've always been there for me. And, when there's no peace in either position, this is where people stall. They stay busy managing the discomfort instead of making a decision. They tell themselves, it's not bad enough. They remind themselves of the good moments and say, what a great time we've always had. But then you might have had a great time, but where's the balance? So they wait for clarity to arrive fully formed, but clarity rarely arrives at certainty. It arrives at repetition. It's the same thing over and over and over again. The same conversation, the same disappointment, the same explanation, delivered more carefully each time. I used to say to my ex-husband, okay, I forgive you until next time. That repetition is the decision point, not because you're angry, not because someone is terrible, but because you are tired of negotiating your own needs. And once you reach that point, the question is no longer, how do I fix this? The question becomes, what am I willing to continue tolerating? And, in the last few weeks, months, I've been making my friends do all the work, and I wouldn't blame them if they started asking that question. And I don't want to lose them, so I'm going to put myself back in the ring. But once you recognize that decision point, there's a tendency to jump straight into extremes. Stay and suffer, or leave and burn everything down. And that binary keeps people stuck longer than necessary. In reality, there is a middle ground. And it starts with distance. Distance isn't punishment. It's actually assessment. It looks like pulling back your effort without announcing it. It looks like stopping the extra check-ins, the emotional buffering, the constant availability. It looks like letting the relationship operate without you scaffolding it. This is where many people get uncomfortable because distance forces truth to surface. If the relationship adjusts, if the effort rises to meet the space you created, that tells you something. If the relationship collapses or goes silent, that tells you something too. What matters is that you're no longer doing all the work to keep it alive. Ending a relationship is not the first move. Clarity is. And clarity often comes when you stop rescuing the dynamic and allowing it to reveal its actual capacity. This is also where self-trust gets tested, because the moment you step back, doubt shows up. You wonder if you're being cold, dramatic, or unfair. That is when it helps to remember what Mark Grove says. If you have to convince someone to choose you, the answer is already no. Distant removes the need to convince. It replaces persuasion with observation. And sometimes what you observe is enough to keep going with the new boundaries. Other times, it makes the ending inevitable. Not because you failed, but because the relationship cannot meet you where you are anymore. Choosing distance gives you the data you need. Choosing the end comes after. And either choice, when made from clarity instead of exhaustion, is an act of self-respect. So I think I will add another song that goes along with the topic we're speaking about today. And it's I Can't Make You Love Me by Bonnie Raitt. This song is not about heartbreak in the dramatic sense. It's about acceptance. And that distinction is everything. I Can't Make You Love Me sits exactly at the decision point we've been talking about in this episode. Not the moment of anger, not the moment of collapse, the moment where reality becomes unavoidable. What makes this song so powerful is the restraint. There is no bargaining, no justification, no attempt to convince. The narrator is not asking for more effort or clearer communication. She's already done that work internally. The core message is simple and devastating. Love cannot be negotiated. Presence cannot be forced. Effort cannot be extracted through patience or loyalty. And that is the truth many people resist in one-sided relationships. I've done it many times. This song captures the moment when emotional labor finally stops. When the narrator understands that continuing to try would require self-abandonment. Instead of framing that as a failure, she frames it as honesty. There is something incredibly grounding about that. The narrator does not blame the other person, but she also does not blame herself. In one-sided relationships, people tend to swing to extremes. Either the other person is cruel or they themselves are not enough. This song rejects both narratives. What it says instead is it's not mutual, that this is reason enough to stop. From a relational standpoint, this is emotional maturity in its cleanest form. It acknowledges that feelings are not owed, that effort does not entitle you to reciprocity, and that staying past the point of clarity only deepens the damage. This is not resignation, this is self-respect. And the quiet strength in this song mirrors what happens when someone chooses distance instead of escalation. There's no dramatic exit, there's no speech, just an internal line being drawn. And that line sounds like peace. What makes this song especially relevant for this episode is that it validates walking away without rewriting history. The relationship mattered. The effort was real. And still, it was not enough to make it sustainable. That is a hard truth for people to pride themselves on, loyalty and endurance. But endurance is not the same as alignment. This song does not end with hope of change. It ends with acceptance of reality, and that acceptance is what frees the narrator from continuing to negotiate with herself. In the context of one-sided relationships, this song is not about loss. It's about release. Release from trying harder. Release from managing someone else's capacity. Release from shrinking yourself to keep something alive that cannot meet you where you are. And that is why this song belongs here. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop asking someone to love you back. And when a song ends like that, there's nothing left to argue with. No storyline to fix, no version of events that needs to be defended. It's just clarity. And that is the part people miss. Acceptance is not passive. It is decisive. It is the moment you stop negotiating with reality and start respecting yourself. One-sided relationships do not end because someone is bad. They end because effort never balances. And eventually the cost of staying exceeds the fear of letting go. If this episode resonates, it's not because you're broken or asking for too much. It's because you are finally listening to part of you that has been quietly keeping score. You do not need to prove your worth to earn mutuality. You do not need better language to justify basic effort. You do not need one more conversation to validate what you already know. Sometimes the most self-respecting choice is not to try harder. It's just to stop. Stop explaining. Stop caring. Stop shrinking. Let effort meet you where you stand. And if it cannot, let that be the answer. And that's not failure. That's alignment. And as we close the conversation, I want to be clear about one thing. Recognizing a one-sided relationship is not about hardening yourself. It's about refining your standards. The work does not stop at awareness. What comes next is learning how to rebuild trust with yourself after you've stopped overfunctioning. How to sit in the quiet that follows distance. How to resist the urge to rush back into old patterns just because they feel familiar. And that is what we'll talk about next week. How to rebuild self-trust after imbalance. How to stop mistaking anxiety for connection, and how to choose relationships that do not require you to abandon yourself to keep them alive. Because the goal in life is not to love less. It's to love without a self-eraser. So before you move on with your day, sit with one question. Where in your life are you still doing the work that should be shared? And let that answer guide what you do next. I want to thank you all for joining me today. I love doing my podcast, even though it's just me, myself, and I. Crazy thing is, I am in a huge stage of transition again. It's almost like that Chris Stapleton song starting over. It really is. And it's very scary. I am not going to lie. But I'm a 53-year-old determined woman that's going to get through just about anything. I was laying in bed last night thinking to myself, I'm stiff and I'm sore, and I'm thinking it's got to be stress that's happening because my body can't die on me yet. And I think that's the only thing that could ever stop me is my physical body fading out, and I don't know how I would survive that. But everything in my mind is quite stable and functional, and with this one-sided relationship aha moment I had, I'm still very accountable for my own actions and how I've behaved to certain friends and how I aspire to have new friendships and new relationships and new partnerships, that it's basically that mutuality that we all need and deserve. So what I'd love from you is if you give me a follow on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. Possibly follow me on Spotify so you get my weekly podcast updates. And I want to thank you for being here, and I hope that you and I can create a two-sided friendship. And then as we roll through the waves of life and try to figure out everything we're doing one step at a time together. Till next time.